There is a kind of woman who learned to take care of herself before anyone thought to ask if she needed taking care of. She made her own lunch at 7. She figured out her own homework because nobody was sitting at the table to help. She navigated school drama and heartbreak and the confusing machinery of growing up mostly alone, not because she was abandoned in any dramatic sense, but because the adults in her house were somewhere else, emotionally, physically, or both. And she learned early that waiting for someone to notice was not a reliable strategy. So she stopped waiting. She became, without anyone naming it, a girl who raised herself. My name is Betty, and I want to talk today about the psychology of boomer women who raised themselves, who they became, what they carry, and why the self-sufficiency that looks like strength from the outside sometimes feels, from the inside, like a room with no door. According to research from the American Psychological Association, approximately 1 in 4 adults reports having grown up in a household where at least one parent was emotionally unavailable for significant periods of childhood due to mental illness, addiction, chronic stress, overwork, or simply a generational incapacity for emotional presence. Among boomer women specifically, that number is likely higher, given that their parents, members of the silent generation and the greatest generation, were themselves raised in eras that placed almost no value on parental emotional attunement. These were people who survived the Depression and the war. They provided, they showed up, they kept the house and put food on the table. What they often could not do was sit with a child's feelings and reflect them back with warmth and understanding, because nobody had ever done that for them either. So the boomer girl who grew up in one of these households didn't receive a neglectful parent in the storybook sense. She received a parent who was doing exactly what they knew how to do. What was missing was invisible, the attunement, the emotional responsiveness, the sense that her inner life was something an adult was genuinely curious about. And the absence of something invisible is very hard to grieve because you spend most of your childhood not even knowing it's gone. You just know you handle things yourself, and you get very good at it. Here is what getting very good at it looks like. By the time the boomer girl who raised herself was a teenager, she had developed a set of skills that her peers often lacked entirely. She could read a room, she could sense when the mood at home was difficult and adjust her behavior before anything happened. She could manage her own emotions without external support, because external support was not available, and falling apart was not an option she had been given. She was, by most external measures, remarkably competent. Teachers liked her, she was responsible, she didn't cause problems, and nobody looked closely enough to see that the competence was not a personality trait. It was a survival strategy that had calcified into what looked like a personality trait. Psychologist Lindsay Gibson, in her book Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents, describes this pattern with a precision that boomer women in online spaces have been sharing with each other for years. Gibson identifies what she calls the role self, the identity a child develops in response to what the family needs, rather than who the child actually is. The girl who raised herself often becomes the role self of the capable one, the one who handles things, the one who doesn't need much, the one who is fine, and the fineness becomes so practiced and so consistent that it stops feeling like a performance and starts feeling like the truth. She is fine, she has always been fine, she will always be fine. Except that underneath the fineness there is a person who never had anyone sit with her when she was not fine, and who learnt so early not to show the not fine parts that she sometimes can't find them herself anymore. The research on what psychologists call compulsive self-reliance is illuminating here. A 2022 study published in the journal Developmental Psychology found that children who grew up with emotionally unavailable caregivers showed elevated rates of compulsive self-reliance in adulthood, a pattern where asking for help produces genuine anxiety, accepting support feels uncomfortable or suspicious, and vulnerability with other people is avoided even in relationships that are safe enough to allow it. The boomer woman who raised herself is often deeply loved by the people in her life. Her children admire her. Her friends rely on her. Her partner counts on her steadiness. And she is, quietly and persistently, one of the loneliest people in the room. not because she lacks connection, because the connection she has is always flowing outward. She gives, she supports, she shows up. And when it is her turn to receive, something in her closes. She deflects the compliment, she minimizes the problem, she says she's fine before anyone finishes asking, because receiving feels like exposure, and exposure is the thing that was never safe. There is a particular loneliness that lives inside a very capable woman, and it is worth naming precisely. It is not the loneliness of isolation, it is the loneliness of invisibility inside connection, of being with people who love you and still feeling fundamentally alone, because the part of you that most needs to be seen is the part you have spent a lifetime making sure nobody could find. AARP's 2025 Loneliness Report found that adults who self-report high self-sufficiency are paradoxically more likely to report chronic loneliness than adults who report moderate self-sufficiency, because the same trait that protects them from certain vulnerabilities also prevents them from accessing the deep mutual intimacy that protects against loneliness in the long run. The capable woman is admired. She is not always known, and being admired is not the same as being known, not even close. A lot of you have been writing in about this, about the moment in midlife when the children grew up and the house got quiet and suddenly there was space for the first time to feel things that had been waiting in a room with the door closed. About the exhaustion that appeared without warning, not physical exhaustion, something older and deeper than that. About the strange disorientation of reaching an age when nobody needs you in the old constant way, and realizing you don't know who you are when you're not being needed. That disorientation is real, and it has a name. It is what happens when the role self that kept you functional for 50 years no longer has a role to play, and the question underneath it, who am I when I'm not handling something, turns out to be one you have never had to answer before. Here is what makes this specific to the boomer woman. She grew up in an era that celebrated the capable woman without examining the cost of that capability. The woman who managed everything was admired. The woman who asked for help was pitied or considered weak. The cultural story she was handed said that competence was feminine virtue, and she internalized it completely, and she performed it for decades, and the performance was real, the competence was genuine. But underneath the competence was a girl who learned to parent herself because no one else was doing it, and that girl never entirely went away. She is still there, in the boomer woman in her 60s who insists on driving herself to the appointment, who doesn't want to be a burden, who deflects when her daughter offers to help with something, who lies awake at 3 in the morning managing a problem alone that would be lighter if she shared it, but sharing it feels like failure in a way she cannot fully articulate because the feeling is older than her words for it. And here is the thing about the boomer woman who raised herself that most people on the outside consistently miss. She did not come out of that childhood damaged, she came out of it forged. The ability to regulate her own emotions without support, to read a room accurately, to anticipate what is needed before anyone asks, to show up in a crisis without falling apart, these are not compensations for something that went wrong. They are real capacities built in real circumstances that have made her genuinely valuable to every person and institution she has ever been part of. The cost of those capacities is real too. Both things are true. The Cigna Health 2025 Loneliness Report found that 60% of boomer adults qualify as lonely by clinical measure, and that women who self-describe as highly independent are disproportionately represented in that group. The independence and the loneliness are connected, and the connection runs straight back to the kitchen table where a 7-year-old made her own lunch and decided, without words, that she was going to be someone who handled things. Here is what the research suggests is actually happening for a lot of these women in their 60s and 70s, and it is something closer to hope than it first sounds. A 2023 longitudinal study from the University of California found that adults who had developed compulsive self-reliance in childhood showed measurable shifts toward emotional openness in their later decades, a period researchers describe as a late life softening, where the defenses that were necessary for survival begin to relax as the circumstances that made them necessary change. The children are grown, the proving is largely done, the house is quieter. And in that quiet, some of these women are finding for the first time that they can let someone else carry something for a moment without the world ending, that they can say, "I don't know how I'm doing," and mean it, that the version of themselves that exists when they are not being capable is not weak, it is just human, and human, it turns out, was always enough. If you are the woman who raised herself, here is what I want to say. The girl who figured it out alone was extraordinary. What she built without a blueprint and without a safety net, and it is real, and it belongs to her entirely. But she does not have to keep building alone. The door that was always closed from the outside can be opened from the inside, not all at once, not to everyone, but to one person in one honest moment when the moment is right. That is enough. That is the whole beginning. Leave me a comment and tell me one thing you learned to do for yourself as a child that you are still doing alone today. I really want to know. Thanks for being here with me.